I was driving past my son-in-law's house and decided to check on him, but when I saw my husband's car at the gate, a shiny silver Lexus that should have been in our garage, my heart clenched with a premonition of trouble. Something's wrong, I thought, and I quietly approached the window, trying not to give myself away. What I heard inside destroyed and changed my world forever. When the old woman finally signs the papers, we'll have everything we planned for. My son-in-law's voice drifted through the half-open window like poison in my veins. I sat frozen in my car outside Brianna's house, keys still dangling from the ignition. 5 minutes ago, I had called my daughter to surprise her with dinner plans. "Sorry, Mom, I'm not home, but Dan's there working on some case files," she had said cheerfully. Yet here was my husband's silver Lexus parked brazenly in the driveway. I killed the engine and approached the window on trembling legs. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see them clearly. My husband of 25 years lounging on my daughter's couch like he owned the place, and Dan leaning against the bookshelf with that smug expression I had grown to despise. "The timeline's perfect," Dan was saying, his lawyer voice crisp with satisfaction. "File in June, claim irreconcilable differences. With the new Iowa statutes, Clara's entitled to half of everything acquired during marriage, plus spousal support for life." My husband laughed, that low, confident chuckle I had once found comforting. "The construction business alone is worth $12 million. Add the rental properties, the vacation home, the investments. We're looking at nearly $20 million total." My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, hitting record just as Dan continued his legal dissertation. "The beautiful part is her trusting nature. Clara has no idea we've been documenting her assets for months. Bank statements, real estate deeds, business valuations, they've all been copied." He gestured toward a brown folder on the coffee table. "She practically gave us the keys to her kingdom," my husband said, leaning back with a smug smile, feigning interest in my constant worries about the construction job, nodding sympathetically whenever I mentioned payroll. "My God, she really believes you love her." A twig snapped under my feet. Both of them froze mid-conversation, heads turning toward the window like startled deer. I pressed myself against the brick wall, heart hammering against my ribs, sweat beating despite the April chill. "Did you hear something?" My husband's voice carried a note of suspicion. "Probably just the neighbor's cat," Dan replied after a pause. "You're paranoid." "Can you blame me if Clara discovered this before we're ready?" my husband muttered. "She won't. The woman couldn't spot a conspiracy if it wore a neon sign." Dan's laughter held nothing but contempt. "By September, you'll be divorced, wealthy, and free to do whatever you want with whoever you want." I forced myself to stay hidden until their conversation resumed, my phone capturing every venomous word. When I finally crept back to my car 15 minutes later, my entire world had shifted on its axis. 25 years of marriage, reduced to a legal strategy session between my husband and son-in-law. The folder on that coffee table haunted me, months of planning, documentation, preparation. While I had been working 16-hour days to build our future, they had been systematically mapping its destruction. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at my hands wrapped around the steering wheel. The same hands that had held our family together through decades of sacrifice, that had provided every comfort my husband enjoyed, that had stood by him when no one else would. My husband's mocking words echoed in my memory. "God, the woman actually believes I love her." The worst part? Until 30 minutes ago, I absolutely did. The front door opened just as I reached for my car keys. My husband emerged first, his jacket draped carelessly over his arm, followed by Dan adjusting his tie with practiced precision. Neither expected to find me sitting in my Honda, and the shock registered on my husband's face like a slap. "Clara." His voice climbed an octave. "What are you doing here?" I forced my expression into something resembling normalcy, though my pulse thundered in my ears. 25 years of marriage had taught me to read his moods, but apparently he had been acting the entire time. "Just finished a job site inspection nearby," I lied smoothly, climbing out of the car. Thought I'd stop by and see Brianna. Dan stepped protectively closer to my husband, his lawyer instincts kicking in. Those pale gray eyes studied my face with uncomfortable intensity, searching for cracks in my story. "She's not here," my husband said quickly. "We were just, I was helping Dan organize some legal documents for a client." The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. How many lies had I swallowed over the years without question? "Oh," I kept my voice light, conversational. "I thought you'd be at work until 6 o'clock today. Didn't you mention something about the Henderson proposal this morning?" A flicker of panic crossed my husband's features. "I left early. Headache." "Sorry to hear that." I turned to Dan with manufactured friendliness. "Working on an interesting case?" "Asset division," he replied without thinking, then caught himself. "For a divorce client. Very complex financial situation." The irony would have been amusing if it weren't destroying my life. My husband's eyes darted between Dan and me, calculating. "How long have you been here, Clara?" "Just pulled up." "Why?" "No reason," he said, but his smile looked painted on. "You look stressed. Are you okay?" The man who had been plotting to destroy my finances for months was asking how I was doing. I almost laughed. "It's been a long day, you know." I gestured toward Dan. "Don't let me interrupt your work." "We just finished," Dan said, his hand resting possessively on my husband's back. The gesture seemed so familiar, so intimate. How long had this been going on? Then it's about time. I pulled out my phone to check the time, making sure they could see the device. Neither reacted, but I caught Dan's eyes lingering on the screen. "I should head home anyway. Dinner won't cook itself." My husband's laugh sounded forced. "I'll be along shortly. Just need to wrap up a few things here." "Take your time." I opened my car door, then paused as if remembering something. "Oh, Alan, Dr. Patterson's office called about rescheduling your physical, something about a conflict with your work schedule." His face went blank for a split second, the look of someone whose lie had been exposed. Then he recovered with impressive speed. "Must be a mix-up. I'll call them later. No worries." These things happen. I slid into the driver's seat, heart hammering. "See you both later." As I backed out of the driveway, I watched them in my rearview mirror. They stood frozen until my car disappeared around the corner, then immediately moved closer together, heads bent in urgent conversation. The three-way dance of deception was complete. They suspected I might have overheard something. I knew they were planning to destroy me, and all of us were pretending everything was perfectly normal. My husband would drive home separately, armed with explanations for his early departure from work and his presence at Dan's house. He'd probably arrived at a dozen reasonable justifications by the time he walked through our front door, but he didn't know about the recording on my phone. 43 minutes of crystal-clear audio that would change everything. I pulled into traffic, hands steady on the wheel for the first time in an hour. The shock was wearing off, replaced by something colder and more focused. They thought they were playing chess with a checkers player. They were about to discover their mistake. The 15-minute drive home passed in a blur of traffic lights and muscle memory. My Honda found its way into our circular driveway without conscious direction, past the manicured gardens. My husband insisted we pay someone else to maintain it, past the fountain he'd commissioned for our 20th anniversary. I sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the house I had poured my life into since 1995. Every board, every nail, every carefully planned detail had been a love letter to the man who was now plotting to steal it from me. The front door opened into a silence that felt different now, not peaceful, but hollow. My husband's presence had always filled these rooms with chatter about his day, complaints about coworkers, excitement over new purchases. Now I wondered how much of it had been performance. The wedding photo on the mantel caught my eye first. December 15th, 1987. I was radiant in ivory silk, a young secretary just starting out at Morrison & Associates downtown. Alan stood beside me, slightly awkward in his rented tuxedo, but glowing with what I had believed was genuine happiness. He was 22 then, just another construction worker earning by the hour, while I was 37, finally climbing into a position of real authority after 10 years of relentless work. I was certain I was marrying into love, not betrayal. We'd met at the company Christmas party that year. Morrison was one of Alan's clients. He'd renovated their offices the previous spring. I had laughed at his terrible joke about concrete mixers, a sound like silver bells that even surprised me with its sincerity. When he asked me to dinner, I blushed and said yes. So quickly I wondered if he had been waiting for me to say yes. Our first date at Romano's Italian restaurant stretched until midnight. I listened with genuine interest as Alan described his dreams of building something lasting, something that would outlive us both. My eyes lit up as he talked about the houses he wanted to build, the families he wanted to protect. "I'm not just building structures," he said, reaching across the table to touch mine. "I'm building homes." 6 months later, he proposed. On the kitchen table was our 25th anniversary card from last December, Alan's handwriting still elegant in blue ink. "To my wonderful wife, thank you for making all my dreams come true. Here's to 25 more years of happiness. All my love, Alan." All his love. The phrase tasted bitter now. I moved to the living room where Brianna's baby pictures lined the built-in shelves I had crafted during my pregnancy. June 8th, 1995, the day our daughter was born. Alan, exhausted but radiant, holding our red-faced miracle like he had been created for fatherhood. Those first years had been the happiest of my life. Alan threw himself into being a father with the same intensity he had once brought to planning our wedding, parent-teacher conferences, soccer games, birthday parties with elaborate themes. Alan documented every moment with fierce paternal pride. "You're the best mother in the world," he told me the night Brianna graduated high school, tears streaming down his face as we watched our daughter accept her diploma. "She's going to do incredible things because of the foundation you gave her." The foundation I gave her, not we. Had the cracks been showing even then? I sank into my leather recliner, the one Alan always complained was too ugly for the formal living room, and let the memories wash over me. Our 10th anniversary cruise to Alaska. Alan genuinely delighted by the glaciers and wildlife. Brianna's college graduation, all of us crying as she walked across the stage with her psychology degree. Christmas mornings filled with laughter and chaos, Alan insisting on elaborate decorations that took weeks to install and only one day to dismantle. When had gratitude transformed into entitlement? When had thank you for providing this life become, "We deserve so much more"? The recording on my phone held the answer. Alan hadn't loved me in years, possibly decades. Every kiss, every anniversary celebration, every "I love you" whispered in the darkness had been calculated. Manipulation designed to keep me working, earning, building wealth he could eventually claim as his own. 25 years of my life reduced to a legal strategy session. I sat in the growing darkness of our living room, surrounded by the evidence of what I had believed was a happy marriage, and felt something cold and analytical settling over the grief. Alan thought he was being clever, maneuvering in secret for financial gain while hiding behind a mask of devotion. He had no idea that the very woman he underestimated was already 10 steps ahead. $50 million over 3 years, the largest project in company history. I had come home that April evening, expecting celebration, maybe champagne, definitely the enthusiastic support that had sustained me through every previous milestone. Instead, Alan had been sitting at the kitchen table with a real estate magazine and a calculator. "This means we can finally afford the house on Elm Street," Alan had announced, without even looking up from the magazine. "The one with the circular driveway and the pool. The Hendersons are asking $4.2 million. Not congratulations on my achievement, not pride in the project that would employ 300 people for 3 years. Just immediate focus on what my success could buy him." "Alan, I haven't even started the project yet," I said quietly. but he waved me off with that dismissive shrug I'd come to know too well. To him, every milestone in my career was just another opportunity to upgrade his lifestyle. The new house, the country club membership, the luxury cars, the European vacations. Not our expenditures, Alan's demands. The pronouns had been telling all along, though I'd been too focused on project logistics to notice. By 2021, the requests had escalated. The country club membership became non-negotiable once the Pattersons joined Riverside Hills. Our perfectly adequate vacation cabin in Wisconsin suddenly became embarrassing compared to the Johnsons' place in Aspen. Alan began to offer his real wife a few lullabies about how to please him. Did you hear? Sarah Mitchell gave her husband a brand new Mercedes for their anniversary, Alan had pointed out last month, his voice heavy with envy, as if daring me to match her generosity. Alan cut his salmon with surgical precision, as if every bite was some silent testimony to all he'd sacrificed for our marriage. Sacrificed, as though supporting my career while living in comfort had cost him something unbearable. The friendship with Dan had intensified after Brianna's wedding in September 2023. Suddenly, Alan became fascinated by legal proceedings, tossing out hypothetical questions about property division and spousal rights. For a friend who might need advice. He'd started receiving phone calls that sent him into the other room, claiming they were book club discussions or volunteer committee meetings. How many of those phone calls had actually been planning sessions? I pulled out my phone and replayed part of the recording from earlier. Dan's voice was unmistakable. We've been tracking her assets for months. Alan's laugh followed, sharp and cutting. 10 years of pretending to be the supportive husband. Suddenly, his sudden curiosity about my financial reports, his questions about valuations, and his push for joint accounts while keeping his own hidden credit lines. All of it fell into place. He had been collecting information while I was busy building the career that supported us both. But Alan made a critical miscalculation. He assumed the woman he lived with was blind to strategy. He had no idea that the same mind that had risen from a secretary's desk to an executive office could also turn cold and precise when betrayed. They thought they were playing chess against someone who didn't even know the rules. For months, Alan had been quietly moving his pieces on the board, convinced I wouldn't notice the game. But he was about to learn that I understood strategy better than he ever imagined. Rising from the recliner, I walked into my home office, shelves lined with decades of records, contracts, pay slips, and documents that bore witness to the years I had built while he pretended to sacrifice. Tax returns, employment contracts, partnership papers, property deeds, every file Alan thought he'd been secretly copying. But he didn't know what I knew. The true security of my life's work wasn't in these shelves. Picking up my phone, I scrolled until I found the name I trusted. Marcus Webb, my longtime accountant, and the only one aware of the structures I had set up years earlier to safeguard everything from opportunists. It was time to make a call that would shift everything. Within 3 days, my office had transformed into a war room. 2 laptops glowed on the desk, screens filled with financial statements, legal databases, and property records. Yellow pads covered every surface, divided into columns marked assets, weaknesses, timelines, and leverage points. The grief that had once consumed me had sharpened into a plan. That morning, I dressed with care, slipping into a tailored suit and the reading glasses Alan once mocked for making me look too serious. Strange, how quickly grief could harden into strategy when you had spent decades climbing from a secretary's desk to an executive office. Marcus Webb had given me more support than I dared hope, arming me with the clarity I needed. Years ago, I had secured 3 international accounts, perfectly legal, fully documented, yet invisible to anyone without deep forensic skills. Alan's amateur sleuthing had missed them entirely. While he and Dan obsessed over the visible pieces of my life, the real foundation remained protected. Still, his carelessness had left traces, credit card records that revealed spa treatments, designer shopping sprees, and transfers funneled into a hidden joint account. $47,000 in unauthorized transfers over 8 months, money funneled into a savings account I had never opened. The beneficiary's name made my blood run cold: Daniel Thompson. Alan and Dan had been aligning themselves as financial partners long before their conspiracy against me became clear. The paper trail revealed luxury lunches at Riverside Country Club, $300 spa treatments, designer shopping sprees that suspiciously matched the nights Alan claimed to be at committee meetings. Every expense painted the same picture. Alan wasn't preparing for our future. He was preparing for a life without me. The irony was sharp. Just last week, he'd complained about grocery costs, yet here were handbags worth thousands, bought with stolen money. And Dan's own vulnerabilities only added fuel to my resolve. My contacts in the business community had been generous with information about Davenport's most ambitious attorney. The man who thought he could help Alan strip me of everything was drowning in debt: $180,000 in student loans, an $8,500 monthly office lease chosen for show rather than sense, and a reputation for cutting corners whenever money grew tight. "He's sharp," one contractor told me over coffee, "but he's got champagne tastes on a beer budget." He owed nearly $25,000 to 3 subcontractors, promises made but never honored. The State Bar Association's website confirmed 2 dismissed complaints in the past year, both tied to misuse of client funds. Dismissed, yes, but not forgotten. In law, even smoke leaves a stain. I leaned back in my chair, letting the evidence settle into place. Alan and Dan had underestimated me spectacularly. They saw only the woman they thought was too busy working to notice. What they failed to recognize was that betrayal doesn't dull a sharp mind, it hones it. The phone rang, Brianna's name glowing on the screen. "Hey, sweetheart," I said warmly, steadying my voice. "How's your day?" "Mom, I need to ask you something," she began, tone careful, the kind she used with difficult clients. "Is everything okay between you and Dad? Lately, whenever you're together, the tension feels off." My grip on the phone tightened. How much did she sense? How much had Alan and Dan already fed her? "What makes you ask?" I kept my voice even. "Little things," she said. "Dad seems restless about money, which makes no sense since your career's been thriving. And Dan keeps slipping in these odd questions. About company structures, about who controls what assets. It feels like they're fishing for information, but I don't know why." Fishing for information. My daughter's psychology training had caught the predatory tone her father and husband thought they'd hidden. She couldn't see the whole conspiracy yet, but she was circling dangerously close. "Probably just curiosity about the business world," I told Brianna gently. "Your father has always been interested in financial security." "Maybe," she replied, unconvinced. "But Mom, if something was really wrong, you'd tell me, wouldn't you?" Her question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Tell her what? That her father was conspiring to gut me financially? That her husband was orchestrating the scheme? That the family she trusted was rotting from within? I forced a smile she couldn't see over the phone. "Of course, sweetheart. Everything's fine. Just the usual work pressures." After we hung up, I sat staring at my notes. Dan hadn't just been circling me. He'd been probing my daughter, too. The scope of their intelligence gathering was broader than I had realized. It was time to ensure they only received the information I chose to release. I was still digesting Brianna's warning when my secure line rang. Sarah Chen, my accountant for 12 years, spoke with her usual crisp efficiency. "Clara, I've prepared the asset protection documents for your signature. When you mentioned updating estate planning, I went ahead and researched optimal structures. This is about more than estate planning, isn't it?" Her perception made me smile. "You're right, Sarah. 28 years in forensic accounting has taught you how to read between the lines." "What kind of threat are we protecting against?" Sarah asked quietly. "The domestic kind," I replied. Her silence told me she understood more than words could carry. She had managed divorces for 3 of my employees. She knew exactly what battlefield I was stepping onto. "I'll have everything ready by noon," she promised. Your business assets will be sealed off, invisible to anyone trying to claw at your personal wealth. By 10 a.m., I was sitting across from Evelyn Grant, president of First National Bank and a longtime acquaintance from charity boards. The polished mahogany conference room smelled faintly of leather and coffee, a familiar arena where I had negotiated countless deals. "Account security review," I said calmly, sliding the documents across the table. "I need to verify and temporarily freeze all shared access points while I verify my identity," I continued. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "This is obvious, Clara. Every joint account, every credit line, every automated transfer system." "Every single one," I confirmed. Her question hung in the air. "May I ask why?" But I smiled and interrupted. "You're not allowed." Evelyn studied my face for a long moment. "You do realize this will inconvenience Alan severely." "That's the idea," I answered without flinching. At 11:47 a.m., the security holds activated. Every shared account, every line of credit, every automated system now required in-person verification. The timing was perfect. Just as Alan sat down for his weekly lunch at Riverside Country Club, his financial world quietly locked behind steel doors. At 12:03 p.m., my phone buzzed with the first declined transaction alert. I was reviewing project reports when, at 12:50, Alan's panicked call came through. "Clara, something's wrong with the accounts. My card was declined at lunch, and the bank says there's a hold. Do you know anything about this?" His voice carried the tone of innocence he had perfected over years. No mention of Dan's name, no hint of the $47,000 he'd siphoned away. "That sounds serious," I replied evenly. "Did they say what triggered it?" Alan muttered something about identity verification and account access, but his real concern slipped out. "It's embarrassing, Clara. I was sitting with Linda and Susan and Janet, and I couldn't even pay for lunch." His pride, not his conspiracy, was the wound that stung most. The panic in Alan's voice was real, not because of the sound of battle, but because the warrior's social image had been damaged. After years of character, I knew that willingness to pay was more important than loyalty. "I'll call Evelyn Grant right away," I said softly. "We'll work it out." But I thought about calling Evelyn. Instead, I drove to one of my company's active sites, where crews were laying steel beams for a new medical center. The clang of machinery and steady rhythm of hammers felt grounding after 3 days of silent financial warfare. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages throughout the afternoon. "Alan, 1:47 p.m. Still can't access any accounts." Alan, 2:23 p.m. Evelyn's secretary says she's in meetings all day. What kind of bank president ignores her clients? Alan, 3:15 p.m. Even the emergency credit line is frozen. How am I supposed to buy groceries? Each message brought me a grim satisfaction. For years, Alan had taken financial security for granted, while I worked endlessly to provide it. Now he finally knew how it felt when that security vanished without warning. By late afternoon, Alan's panic was only the prelude. Dan's reaction proved far more revealing. At 4:30 p.m., my private investigator, Mike Rodriguez, called with an update. Thompson tried to access his joint account with Alan 3 times this afternoon. When that failed, he attempted to withdraw funds from what appears to be a trust account. Mike continued, "It's probably your daughter's education fund that he manages. That one's frozen too, just as you instructed." His demeanor? Furious. Angry phone calls to bank representatives, threats of legal action, demands to speak with senior management. Classic overconfident attorney discovering his leverage has evaporated. By 6 p.m., I sat in my home office reviewing the day's battlefield. Every shared account frozen, every joint credit line suspended, every automatic payment now required my personal authorization. Alan's access to years of accumulated wealth had been reduced to whatever cash he had in his wallet. The banking measures were completely legal, standard protocols under Evelyn Grant's supervision, but Alan and Dan would read the message clearly. The woman they thought was still playing defense had moved her queen into checkmate position. At 6:47 p.m., my phone lit up with Alan's number. The voice on the other end was no longer arrogant, only desperate. "Clara, please, we need to talk." Desperation had stripped away his well-practiced innocence. It was time to see how quickly co-conspirators would start blaming each other once the walls closed in. Mike Rodriguez, my investigator, was stationed at a coffee shop across from Dan's office. At 7:15 p.m., he watched my enemies converge. Alan's frantic call from our driveway had carried loud enough for the neighbors to overhear. "Dan, we need to talk right now. Something's gone terribly wrong." Minutes later, Alan's silver Lexus pulled up to Thompson and Associates. Through the glass doors, two figures rushed inside, their body language screaming crisis mode. Alan and Dan no longer cared about discretion. From Mike Rodriguez's vantage point across the street, Dan's corner office glowed like an emergency command center. Two men hunched over a table littered with files, their frantic gestures betraying panic. Through the building's outdated vents, fragments of their voices carried. Alan's frustration cracked the silence. "Clara knows something. She's cut us off from everything. I couldn't even buy gas today." Dan's reply was sharp, his lawyer's cadence kicking in. "This timing isn't coincidence." 3 days ago," Dan continued, "you said she showed up at Brianna's house right in the middle of our strategy talk. She must have overheard something. How much did she hear?" Alan hesitated. "Enough to know. We're not playing anymore." Papers rustled violently as Dan spread documents across the desk. "Alan, we need to assume she recorded us. Everything we discussed, assets, timelines, strategy, it could all be recorded." The silence that followed was heavy. Two conspirators realizing their victim had been several moves ahead while they celebrated their cleverness. "What do we do now?" Alan's voice cracked, stripped of arrogance. "We accelerate everything," Dan snapped. "No more slow build, no more careful positioning." "Monday morning, I'll file for emergency divorce proceedings with immediate spousal support. We'll claim Clara is engaging in financial abuse by cutting off your access to marital assets." Alan hesitated, but Dan pressed on. "We paint her as a controlling wife who uses money to manipulate and intimidate." The frozen accounts become evidence of Clara's abusive patterns, not defensive strategy. Papers shuffled as Dan's legal mind shifted fully into attack mode. "We'll need you to document instances of emotional abuse, financial control, intimidation tactics. Think back. Every time Clara made financial decisions without consulting you, every time she questioned your spending, every time she influenced your choices through money, we'll build the narrative from there," Alan protested weakly. "Clara's never been controlling about money. If anything, she's been too generous." Dan leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Then we reframe generosity as manipulation. Her providing for you becomes evidence she created financial dependency to maintain control. Every gift, every luxury, every comfort she offered becomes proof of her systematic isolation strategy." The audacity was staggering. They intended to weaponize 25 years of my devotion, turning every sacrifice, every act of love into fabricated evidence of abuse. Then Alan's voice dropped. "What about Brianna? She won't automatically take my side. With her psychology training, she questions everything." Dan seized on it instantly. "That's perfect. Her hesitation will work in our favor. We'll argue it's proof of how completely Clara has manipulated the family dynamic. We'll twist her psychology background, present it as something Clara exploited to alienate her own daughter." Alan's voice faltered. "You want to drag our daughter into this? To make her testify against her own mother?" Dan's reply was ice cold. "I want to protect your financial future. Brianna's professional training gives her testimony extra weight. If she voices even the slightest concern about Clara, we'll frame it as an expert opinion confirming your claims of abuse. We'll turn Brianna's skepticism into a weapon. Every act of love from Clara becomes manipulation. Every protective measure becomes abuse." Dan's voice was clinical, rehearsed, as if outlining a case he'd argued 100 times before. "Monday morning, I'll file for emergency restraining orders, block further asset movement, secure spousal support at $15,000 a month, and demand temporary exclusive occupancy of the marital home. By Wednesday, we'll have Clara painted as an abusive wife who needs court supervision to prevent further intimidation. And if she resists? Dan's smile was razor thin. Then we escalate. Harassment charges if she calls you, stalking if she tries to investigate us, emotional abuse if she challenges our claims. Every reaction becomes evidence against her. The beauty of domestic abuse law is that denial becomes evidence of guilt. The harder Clara resists, the more controlling she looks. Dan's tone dripped with cynicism. Alan gave a humorless laugh. She's trusted me for 25 years. Now she'll learn what that really costs. They spent the next hour aligning their stories, setting up encrypted communication, preparing for what Dan called total legal warfare. Every conversation, every interaction, every financial move would be reframed as proof of Clara's abuse. What had begun as an attempt to seize assets had evolved into a full-blown campaign of character assassination, aimed at destroying not only Clara's fortune, but her reputation, her bond with Brianna, and her standing in the community she'd spent decades building. By 9:30 p.m., Alan slipped out of Thompson & Associates, his phone already buzzing with Dan's first instructions. Remember, you're not a selfish husband anymore. You're a frightened victim, finally brave enough to break free. For them, the war had officially begun. Saturday morning found Alan and Brianna at Caf Luna, the bistro where mother and daughter had shared monthly brunches for 5 years. Alan had chosen their usual corner table, intimate and private, perfect for what he intended. But this time he wasn't playing the role of a loving father. He'd positioned himself as a man seeking his daughter's professional help, not her loyalty. "Brianna, I need to talk to you about your mother," Alan began, his voice carrying carefully calibrated vulnerability. I think something's wrong with her mentally." Brianna set her coffee cup down with the deliberate precision she used whenever she shifted into therapist mode. "What kind of problem, Dad?" Brianna asked. Alan leaned into the role, layering his words with practiced fragility. "Controlling behaviors, paranoid thinking. She's been restricting my access to accounts, saying it's for security reasons, but yesterday she froze me out completely. I couldn't even buy lunch." Brianna leaned forward, her training as a psychologist fully engaged. "Mom, financial control can sometimes be a form of abuse, but it can also be a legitimate precaution during business or legal issues. What's Dad's explanation?" The question was piercing, too neutral, too professional. Clara had been expecting sympathy, not clinical analysis. "He says it's just account security," Clara murmured, her voice carrying a trace of hesitation. "But Brianna, I've been married to him for 25 years. This isn't routine. It feels like punishment." "Punishment for what?" Brianna pressed. Clara faltered, realizing how much truth would unravel if she revealed too much. "I think he suspects I've been questioning our marriage. Maybe he's trying to scare me into staying." Brianna's voice carried the calm patience of someone who'd spent years counseling manipulative patients. "So let me be clear, Mom. Are you saying Dad is using money to control you and stop a divorce? Or are you admitting you're thinking about leaving him and he's just protecting the assets?" The distinction landed like a blade, too sharp, too close to truth. Clara's pulse quickened. She shifted tactics instantly. "I'm saying your father has been showing worrying changes in behavior," Clara replied carefully, her tone sliding into a softer plea. "And as a psychologist, I thought you could give me insight into what's happening." Brianna's eyes narrowed. "As a psychologist, I'd say major behavioral changes usually have triggers. So what happened 3 days ago that made Dad suddenly restrict your accounts?" Clara's mind raced, scrambling for an answer that wouldn't expose the conspiracy. Brianna was too well trained to accept emotional manipulation without evidence. Every carefully placed word revealed cracks in Clara's performance. "I don't know what triggered it," Clara whispered. "That's what scares me." But Brianna studied her mother's face with clinical detachment, dissecting micro-expressions and inconsistencies with professional precision. "Mom, are you asking me for psychological advice, or are you asking me to take sides in your conflict with Dad?" The blunt question shattered Clara's strategy. Her daughter wasn't going to provide blind emotional support to validate a false victim narrative. Clara adjusted quickly. "I'm asking you to help me understand what's happening to our family." Brianna's reply was calm, but firm. "Then I suggest you talk honestly with Dad about his concerns instead of asking me to psychoanalyze him through your interpretation." 20 minutes later, Clara stormed out of the cafe, furious at her daughter's professional detachment and silently afraid of the consequences. If Brianna refused to automatically support her, Clara's entire narrative would collapse under scrutiny. Meanwhile, across town at Donovan and Associates, I was handed intelligence that shifted the entire battlefield. Jim Morrison's call came at 10:15 a.m., just as I was reviewing weekend briefs. "Clara? Thought you'd want to know. Dan Thompson has problems with the State Bar Association." "What kind of trouble?" I asked, my pen frozen above the page. 3 subcontractors filed complaints about unpaid invoices last month. Thompson collected fees from the client but never passed payments along. Classic trust account violation if proven. I set down my coffee, my mind already calculating the implications. "How serious is it?" I pressed. "Serious enough," Jim said, "that the Bar Association has scheduled a hearing next week. Thompson is scrambling to find $23,000 to settle the complaints before the investigation closes, the exact figure I had uncovered in my own quiet research. Rumors spread that Dan was under investigation by the State Bar Association for how he handled contractor payments in the Mitchell case. 3 subcontractors had filed complaints of non-payment. Dan had collected fees from his client but failed to distribute them to the trades. A textbook trust account violation if proven. I set my coffee down, my mind instantly calculating the fallout. Word was a hearing had already been scheduled for next week, and Dan was scrambling to come up with $23,000 to make the subcontractors whole before the inquiry closed. That figure matched exactly what I had uncovered earlier as his debt. By 4 o'clock, word reached me from Dan's own office. The Bar Association had called, demanding immediate filings and a mandatory hearing. His paper fortress was caving in. At 4:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a message from Mike Rodriguez. "Thompson just walked out with 3 boxes of files heading to his car. Should I tail him?" I stared at the text, a thin smile tugging at my lips. "No need," I replied. I already knew where he was going. When panic devours a man who built his life on control, every move becomes predictable. Let him run. Let him expose himself. The harder he scrambles, the tighter the noose around his own neck. I sat in my office, watching the city drown slowly in the amber of sunset. There was no need for Mike to follow. I knew exactly where Dan would run. Straight to Allen, 2 rats cornered, clinging to each other in fear. I sipped my tea, a calmness settling in that felt almost alien. 6 days ago, I had been trembling at every discovery, scrambling for defenses. But now, watching my betrayers scatter because of the trap I had set, I felt nothing but clarity. War doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits in silence, letting the enemy panic, letting them reveal themselves. Tonight, I would let them play out the last act of their own tragedy. The door swung open. Brianna walked in, composed, confident, carrying herself not like a daughter meeting her mother, but like a psychologist preparing for a session. She closed the door softly, took the seat across from me, her fingers laced tightly in her lap. "Mom," she said, firm and steady, "we need to talk about Dad." In those deep green eyes, my own from decades ago, I found no worry, no warmth, only the professional coolness of a clinician dissecting a case. Brianna placed her hands neatly on the desk, eyes locked on mine without a blink. "Dad says you've been controlling the money, manipulating emotions. He asked me to use my credentials to support his claim." Each word landed like a blade of ice. She wasn't speaking as my daughter. She was reading an indictment. I drew in a slow breath, alarms ringing in my mind. Alan had planted seeds of suspicion in the very child I once held in my arms, and now she sat across from me, dissecting me like a case study. I stared at my daughter, my chest tightening. Years of raising her, and now she sat across from me like a judge on the bench. I could deny, I could plead, but that would only feed the image Alan was crafting of me, the unstable, manipulative wife. Instead, I unlocked my phone, pulled up the file I had guarded for 6 days. My finger trembled slightly, but my voice did not. You want the truth? Then listen for yourself. A faint hiss, then Dan's voice, cold, deliberate. Same timeline. File the petition, frame it as financial abuse, lock emergency support. Alan followed, smug and venomous. She's trusted me for 25 years. Time to cash in. Brianna didn't blink, but I saw her hand curl slowly into a fist. For the first minute, Brianna kept her mask on, her expression as steady and professional as if she were still in session. But when the words, 25 years of playing the devoted wife, cut through, I saw her eyes glaze. Her hand trembled against her thigh, fingers tightening as though to hold the pain inside. She turned her face away, drew in a deep breath, then looked back at me. This time, it wasn't the gaze of a psychologist. It was the gaze of a daughter whose heart had just been pierced. How long, Mom? Her voice rasped. 6 days, I answered, quiet but steady. In that moment, the icy wall between us began to crack. The room thickened with silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Brianna leaned back, eyes rimmed red, but her voice sharp and unwavering. Mom, I won't let anyone use me to destroy you. Not even you. I won't be a weapon against Dad, but I will stand with the truth. She slid her phone toward me, her hand trembling. Send me the recording. I want to see Dan's face when I confront him with this. I nodded, a mix of ache and relief tightening in my chest. My daughter had chosen the only line left intact, the truth. I watched my daughter rise, her voice trembling yet edged with resolve. I'll confront Dan myself. I want to look him in the eye and watch him lie. I didn't stop her. Some battles a mother must let her child fight so she can see for herself how masks slip. I simply handed Brianna a small USB drive, the duplicate of the recording I had guarded like my final weapon. You'll need this, I told her, watching as her hand closed tightly around it, as though holding the scales of justice itself. As the door shut behind her, I understood. The girl they thought they could use as a pawn was about to become the blade that cut their scheme wide open. I didn't have to wait long. Mike Rodriguez, still shadowing Thompson, sent word almost immediately. Brianna just walked into Dan's office. No appointment. She knocked once and went straight in. I closed my eyes and pictured it. Dan glancing up from his scattered files, that well-rehearsed lawyer's smile flickering, then freezing as my daughter stepped inside. Brianna wouldn't waste time. She'd ask directly, her calm voice sharper than any blade. Uncle Dan, would you like to hear the recording yourself, or should I just play it right now? Just imagining it made the corner of my mouth lift. For the first time in weeks, I could feel the scales tipping firmly in my favor. My phone buzzed again. Mike relayed every detail. He shot to his feet, voice cracking as he denied it. Claimed the recordings were spliced, that you're poisoning the family against him. I pictured Dan, stripped of his lawyer's poise, retreating like a cornered animal. But Brianna didn't flinch. She slid the USB onto his desk. If you're certain this is fake, then let the State Bar review it and decide for themselves. Dan, a man who had built his career on words, suddenly found language betraying him. Mike's next text said it all. He gulped hard, grabbed his water glass, and his hand shook so badly it spilled. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment. That was the instant the man who thought he controlled the game began to lose his grip completely. 17 minutes later, my phone lit up with a single short message from Brianna. "It's done. I believe you." I sat in silence, the last light of the day cutting across my office blinds, my hand gripping the phone tight. 4 words, simple, but as heavy as 25 years of waiting. Brianna walked out of Dan's office not as their pawn, but as a witness. From that moment on, I knew the board had shifted. Alan and Dan hadn't just lost an ally, they had lost the only daughter who had ever trusted them. I leaned back in my chair and opened the worn leather notebook that had followed me for years. For the first time, the ink on its pages wasn't meetings or projects, it was a battle plan. I wrote Brianna's name at the top and drew a single line beneath it. She was no longer just my daughter, she was a witness, a shield, the one proof they could never discredit. Alan might deny, Dan might invent excuses, but when their own voices echoed in their daughter's ears, the truth would stand as evidence carved in stone. I closed the notebook, my fingers resting against the cover. The final act was drawing near, and this time I would not walk into it alone. I closed my eyes and let the final scene play in vivid detail. A room filled with light, the family table draped in white cloth, the same wood I had polished every weekend for years. But this time, dinner wouldn't be for reunion. It would be a trial without a judge. Alan at the head of the table, trying to mask his unease beneath the role of devoted husband. Dan arriving with feigned confidence, but his eyes darting when I placed that small USB before him. And Brianna, my daughter watching it all, the one fair witness they could never dismiss. I wouldn't need to scream. I wouldn't need to weep. All it would take was a single press of a button, and their own voices would dismantle the masquerade they had built for decades. I opened my notebook again and sketched the outline of our familiar dining table. Alan at the head, his throne of habit, the illusion of unshakable authority. Dan placed to his side, close enough to corner him, far enough for Brianna to catch every flicker of his face. I noted, Saturday, 7 p.m. By then the house would be lit, the neighbors settled in their own routines, no ears but ours within those walls. A dinner that would seem ordinary, yet in my hands it would become a tribunal. I was no longer the submissive wife. I was the one arranging the board, and this time every piece would move at my command. I cleared my desk and laid out the files I had hidden away. Bank statements, copies of contracts, transfer records, each stacked in precise order, numbered like exhibits in a real trial. The USB holding the recording sat at the center, a spearhead ready to pierce through every denial. I added printed emails, casual text messages that, when strung together, mapped the entire conspiracy in black and white. Looking at the rows of evidence spread before me, I no longer saw myself as the betrayed wife. I saw the image of a judge preparing to open court, and this time, justice would not be theirs. I stepped into my bedroom and opened the old wooden wardrobe that had followed me through decades. Between worn cardigans and faded shoes, my hand touched a dark wool coat. I hadn't worn it since my mother's funeral. Today, I would wear it like armor. In the mirror, I straightened the collar, smoothed back the silver strands of my hair. The eyes staring back weren't those of the gentle, overlooked woman I once was. They were the eyes of someone who had built the stage and was ready to watch the masks shatter. I drew a long breath. The final battle required no sword, no blade. My weapon was truth, and I had honed it to a razor's edge. I walked into the dining room where the golden light fell across the long wooden table that had seen countless holidays. Tonight, it wasn't a feast table. It was a tribunal. I arranged each chair with precision. Alan's at the head, his throne of habit. I placed a glass of water in front of it, so he'd have no excuse to rise. Dan's chair sat beside it, the small USB already waiting on the white cloth like a silent dagger. Every detail was a thread, binding them to the seats of judgment. Finally, I set Brianna's place directly opposite mine. My daughter would no longer be an observer. She would be the witness. I lowered myself into my chair, back straight, hands resting lightly on the table. No more trembling, no more tears. Only the silence before the door opened and the final act began. The door opened. Alan entered first, still wearing the costume of a devoted husband, tie neatly knotted, polite smile fixed in place. But I caught the twitch at the corner of his eye, the slip that betrayed unease. Dan followed, briefcase in hand, feigning composure. Yet when his gaze fell on the USB resting neatly on the tablecloth, his steps slowed, as if the floor had turned to mud beneath him. Both men took their seats, neither daring to speak. I remained silent too, letting the stillness in the room do its work, turning every passing second into a verdict. My gaze circled the table and landed on Brianna. She gave a subtle nod, a silent signal that she was ready. I laid my hand on the USB, feeling the cold metal under my fingertips. Words were no longer necessary. The evidence would speak for me. Alan cleared his throat, trying to fracture the silence. "Clara, what is all this? Why does it feel so serious?" His tone was soft, almost practiced, but I caught the fragile tremor hiding beneath it. I lifted my head, locking eyes with him. "Tonight, we speak the truth. Not excuses, not performances, just the truth." I didn't answer Alan. Instead, I pressed play. A faint hiss, then Dan's voice filled the room. "File in June. Claim irreconcilable differences. With the new statutes, she'll get half the assets plus lifetime support." The air froze. Alan's head snapped toward Dan, while Dan went pale, lunging forward. That's fabricated." But before he could finish, his own recorded voice continued. "Close to 20 million total. He'll never see it coming." I set the USB back on the table, watching in silence as they writhed inside the snare they had woven themselves. Alan slammed his hand on the table, trying to cloak himself in righteous anger. "Clara, what are you doing? You're destroying this family." I tilted my head, unblinking. Family? Family isn't built on lies and betrayal. If it's collapsing, it's because you already broke it long ago. Brianna's hands clenched on the chair, her voice cutting firm. "I've heard everything. Dad, Uncle Dan, don't deny it. These aren't Mom's words. They're yours." Dan shot to his feet, sweat glistening at his temples. "This is a setup. She's trapping us." I smiled faintly, just enough to silence the room. "No, Dan. I only held up a mirror. And what it shows, that's on you." Alan reached for Brianna's wrist, but she yanked it back, her eyes blazing. "Don't touch me. You betrayed not just Mom, you betrayed me." In that instant, I knew. The scales had tipped. I was no longer alone. The truth and my daughter stood at my side. I rose, pulled a thick folder from my leather bag, and laid it on the table. Transfer records, bank statements, printed emails, page after page I turned, deliberately slow. Every transaction, every plan. You plotted each move, but you forgot. I know how to keep records, too. Alan bent forward, his face drained. Dan froze, mouth open yet speechless. Brianna's eyes locked on them, filled with both hurt and newfound strength. Alan growled, "Clara, you can't do this. We've had 25 years of marriage." My reply was low, steady. "We've had 25 years of deception, Alan. But from this moment on, I'm no longer the shadow behind you. I'm the one in control." Brianna placed her hand on the folder, her voice the final cut. "I'm standing with Mom. And if you deny this again, I'll be the witness in court." Silence stretched. Alan sank into his chair, his eyes vacant. Dan wiped sweat from his brow, his back damp. They had believed me to be the weakest piece, only to realize I was the hand that moved the board. I gathered the USB, slid the folder under my arm. "It ends here. From now on, you'll live with the words you yourselves recorded." Then I turned to Brianna. She gave a small nod. In her eyes, I saw myself, not the little girl I raised, but an ally, ready to walk with me through the storm. I walked out of the dining room, leaving behind the golden light and two shattered faces. The night wind swept through the hall, cool against my skin, but inside me rose a strange warmth, not of victory, but of release. 25 years of marriage had turned to ash in a single evening, yet I felt no fear, because now I was no longer the woman dismissed and underestimated. I was Clara Donovan, and I had claimed justice with my own hands. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.